Have you ever wondered what Disney has to do with your podcast? Okay, probably not. But whether you are a Disney fan or not, we all know that it's the one place in the world that most people can't wait to go back to. And there's a reason for that. And it's because every moment at Disney is strategically engineered to guide the action that Disney wants you to take next. Vance Morris spent years behind the scenes as a Disney executive, learning exactly how they do it. And he is in the studio now to show you the Disney magic, quote unquote, magic, that'll help you keep listeners engaged in between your episodes, what to say and do in the first 30 seconds so they don't drop off, and how to guide someone to actually hit follow and come back for more. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your podcast binge-worthy. Vance, welcome to the show.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Courtney.
I am excited to have you here, especially given your background, because I think most of us listening to the show, we're familiar with the magic of Disney. In fact, we just took our 8-year-old for the first time last November. And I mean, absolute blast. He's already thinking about when can we go back? Most people leave Disney planning their next trip. And most people even know that Disney's doing stuff behind the scenes to get you to upgrade to this or buy that or go here, go there. But I think what most people don't realize are the actual lengths that Disney goes to behind the scenes to engineer how people behave and actually elicit the response that they want. So I'm very excited to unpack this with you. This idea of influencing behavior to drive the outcomes we want, both in our podcast and in the marketing around the podcast. So I think maybe the best place for us to start would be, can you give us some behind the scenes examples from Disney where something was very intentionally designed to positively influence a specific behavior that they want a guest to take next?
Sure. So one of the things that Disney does very well is entertain you while you're in line. So you wait for a lot of things at Disney. You wait for food, wait for the bus, wait for the attraction. And Disney knows that it cannot compress time, but it can make time feel like it's going by a little quicker. So they have what's called line-ertainment, where they entertain you in line. And so it could be interactive things on an app, or if you're at the Haunted Mansion, you're looking at the tombstones, you're playing with the organ and all that stuff. And so they want people to feel that they're not always waiting. And that's what separates them from, all the other amusement parks is, if you go to a Six Flags, you stand in line, wait for the roller coaster, and that's it. Waiting in line at Disney is part of the experience. And we can bring that into our world. And we think about all of the things or all of the times that our listeners or our guests are waiting. So we might be doing stuff behind the scenes, but our guest or our listener is waiting. How do you keep their attention in between episodes, in between interviews, so that you don't lose them? So we have to entertain them while we're not literally in front of them.
Yeah, I think this is an important thing that most hosts never think about. And it's one of the things that's not top of mind even for me when I go to create an episode. What are listeners doing the week in between that my episodes drop? Or what are they doing? Are they getting distracted while they're listening? How can we hold that attention? I'm curious too, if we were to zoom in and kind of look at this, through the Disney lens, what's something small that maybe people would overlook that Disney obsesses over because it plays a big role in shaping that behavior?
In a broad sense, it is Disney's attention to detail, and every detail speaks. So they actually call it everything speaks. And so if you think about your podcast, every detail in it is either enhancing or detracting from the experience. There is no middle ground. If you go to a dentist office and there's a dusty house plant, well, what's that saying about the dentist? You can immediately go to the, oh my God, what do the tools look like that they're using in the mouth? But that dusty house plant is detracting from the experience. So in a podcast, I mean, is there a mannerism? Are you, stumbling over all the time? Are you not picking the right guests that are for your niche? There's all sorts of little details. I mean, Disney just obsesses over them. I was sitting there having coffee one day outside, and the not the agriculture, the horticulture, what do you want to call it? Landscaper, gee whiz, came by, he's snipping the hedges and he's being really exact. And not 5 minutes later, the supervisor walks by with her own little pair of scissors and is snipping the hedges. So it's not micromanaging the details, it's over managing the details that are important to you.
Yeah, this is something that brings up an interesting question, which is how do you manage the details when maybe you don't even know what those details are or should be?
Well, you have to figure out what your listeners are looking for. You have to be your genuine self. And I think, Disney knows who they are and they know their big why, what they are known for. And they also know what they are selling. Disney knows that they're not selling rides or amusements or vacations. They're selling happiness and they're selling memories. So Disney knows exactly what they're selling. For my businesses, I have some home service businesses, and we know that we sell healthy homes. We do it by cleaning, but we sell healthy homes. So you have to know your overall why. Once you have that, then you can dig down into the nitty gritty of the details and say, okay, well, I'm trying to sell X. Is what I'm doing moving it towards X, or is what I'm doing detracting from X?
Yeah. So this brings up another thought for me too, where if we're talking about evoking, let's say for Disney, in Disney's case, happiness, right? That's an emotional state that they're looking to evoke through the actions that they're taking. For the emotional state that we need our listeners to be in to say, take an action on what we're telling them to do next, leave a review, go download this lead magnet, so on
Yep.
and so forth. Is there a specific emotion we should be shooting for? Or is that really up to us as the host to pick the emotion as to what do we want them to feel and then engineer the experience to evoke that?
You have to know what your product is. And I'll say we sell a widget, we sell marketing services, we sell, whatever, advertising, doggy daycare stuff, whatever. But at the end of the day, what are you really selling? What is the underlying thing? So I work with a lot of dentists, and the dentists that I work with, a lot of them sell confidence. They do it by giving you straight teeth and white teeth and all that kind of stuff. But their overarching thing that they sell is confidence. Or financial advisors may sell peace of mind. So yeah, you need to find the emotion that you're truly selling, because that is what's going to get people engaged. It's that emotional connection that you create. And if you don't create an emotional connection, especially within the first 20, 30 seconds, you kind of lost the listener. I call it moment zero. It's that time when you connect with the listener or your customer. And then from there, you have to nurture that emotional connection throughout the episode.
So, when you're working with a client, or let's say you were working with a podcast host as a client, would there be any specific prompts or questions that you would have them do as an exercise to kind of get to the root of that? What is the emotion that we're evoking? How would you have them start that process?
Well, certainly if you have employees, or even if you're a solopreneur, is just start brainstorming these emotions that are around you. Certainly look at your competitors and do the opposite of whatever they're doing, because usually they're wrong. And they are not going deep. Emotion is deep. So you do that, and then ask your clients or ask your listeners, hey, what do you think when it comes down to it? Yes, I know I'm selling a widget, but at the end of the day, how does that make you feel? What's the emotion that, why is it that you listen to me? And there's nothing wrong with asking, your listeners those questions, because you're going to get a lot of great feedback. And so, yeah, I believe that, brainstorming for one, then testing it, because if you might think you're selling one thing and you're really selling something else, and now you're not congruent. And if you have employees, get them involved in this, because they'll let you know, yeah, you know what, I really feel safe when we talk about this, or I always feel happy when we talk about this. So those could be the emotions you're delivering.
Yeah, interesting. And something I hear from a lot of hosts that I speak with is, they hear positive feedback about their podcast. They might hear from listeners, "Oh, I love your show," or "That was a great episode." But then they're really disappointed to find their audience isn't growing, their downloads aren't growing, they haven't gotten a new review in the last 30 days. No sponsors have reached out being like, "Here, we want to give you some money." They're sharing calls to actions and those listeners are not actually taking action. So I'm curious, kind of going back to Disney, we've talked a lot about what they do to evoke emotion and to evoke that experience and to essentially engineer that experience. What about on the flip side of that? What are things that they would never do when it comes to designing an experience, or things that we as podcast hosts need to be avoiding when we're looking to engineer our listeners' experience?
They look at it from the guest point of view, not the company's point of view. If you follow the old WIFM, what's in it for me, you have to be delivering that. And so when you frame it, I mean, Disney is all about the guest experience, whether it's a movie, whether it's a ride, ESPN, whatever company they own, the guest or the listener or the viewer comes first. How do we create the experience for them? And then we figure out, how do we deliver it? So a lot of times we do I'm going to deliver what I want to deliver, and it's not to the listener's benefit. Well, yeah, you're going to be stagnant and probably not growing. But the other thing that I like to say, especially about marketing, and this also goes to your brand or your personality, is you can't be for everybody. And Disney gets accused of this a lot. Like, they're no longer for the average American. Now you've got to have X number of dollars to be able to go to Disney. And is that a bad thing? Well, I guess we could debate that. But Disney knows who they're for. And we have to know who we're for too. And we also have to know who we are not for. So your marketing is designed to do two things. You want to attract the people that you want to do business with, and you want to repel the people that you don't. And just by being yourself, because I've been on a lot of podcasts, and I can tell when the host is not genuine, they're not authentic. And those two things will detract from the experience. Again, that's a detail that will detract from the experience. And listeners can tell when you're not authentic. And so Disney knows, okay, this is what we do well. And we are authentic with it because we know we entertainment, happiness, memories. They got it. And they don't veer from that. And anytime Disney veers from it is when they get in trouble.
Yes. Well, and this brings up a memory that pops into my head about a guest experience I had on someone else's podcast one time. And before we hit record, we're just here talking, Vance, like you and I are talking right now, and just, okay, here's what we're going to cover in the episode and so forth. And then we hit record, and all of a sudden it was like the host became a completely different person. They went into like Joe Rogan mode, and it was like announcer voice and, all this passion that just came out of left field. And I was taken aback by it, honestly. And I said, wait a minute, is this the same person I was just talking to 30 seconds ago? And it was so different. But I am also guilty of this in my own way. Gosh, the early years of my podcast, where I thought I had to be someone, to impress people or to appear really smart. And I would get on my teacher voice and start teaching. And, now my whole personality comes through on the show. But I think this is something that is very common, is my point in sharing this, where a lot of times, we might go into this mode. I call it our podcast mode, or your host voice, where your listeners unconsciously picking up on those vocal signals that are going through your voice because of the things that are going through the 6 inches between your ears, the thoughts that you're thinking as you are presenting on your podcast. And that can almost create, one of my voice coaches used to call it, bulletproof glass between you and your listener. And it keeps them out just enough to where they don't feel deeply connected with you, which then goes back to exactly what you're saying. It kind of prevents them from feeling the emotions that we want them to feel. So this kind of feels like a conundrum, where it's kind of like, my gosh, how do I fix a problem that I don't even know is happening, if it's happening on my show? And what do I do next? So that's what I want to ask you before we get into the next episode, where we are going to get super tactical and kind of break down, how do we engineer an experience for your listeners to drive this specific action you want. For someone listening right now who's kind of like, wow, I've never even thought about this before, what would the first step for them be walking away from this conversation?
Figure out how to engage them outside of the podcast. And especially depending on, I guess, obviously depends on why you're podcasting. If you're doing it and you've got sponsors and you're making money from it, okay, that's one thing. If you're doing it as a lead generation source and you're bringing guests on so that, you might be able to quietly sell them into something, that's another. It really depends on what kind of podcast you're doing, but trying to find ways to engage them outside of it. So can you get them onto an email list? Can you get their physical mailing address? Have you written the book? Can you offer the book? I'm a big fan of getting offline because, well, one, all my competitors are online. They're not in the mailbox hanging on my front door. And so I know that through a newsletter, and this could be additional revenue stream too. Oh, you like my podcast? Well, you'll love my print newsletter where I really go deep into blah, 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 blah. And so now they're not just waiting for the podcast. Now you're showing up in their mailbox or you're showing up in their inbox. Where are you on social media? How are you showing up there? And so really getting away from just the physical podcast and how do we expand your sphere. So that's what I would do is if you can get their information, get them offline and communicate with them that way and build your audience. Because they'll work in tandem. You'll have people on your newsletter list that'll go and start listening to your podcast. Your podcast listeners, like I said, I've got a $97 a month newsletter that you can have those. And it's a great introduction to you and a great entry point to if you have other services, where they can learn about you and be able to, okay, well, what's next?
Yeah. And that's an important point too, about your podcast being part of a greater ecosystem. And sometimes we forget this. And for some people, that podcast is positioned at the top of the funnel. And for many people, we want the podcast to be the center of our ecosystem. Yep. But there's always going to be places where people encounter you. And I know that years ago, they had to encounter you 5 to 7 times. That number's probably higher now with how much demand is on our attention every day. But they have to encounter you enough to begin to trust you, to begin to say, okay, I do like this person. I do want to learn from this person. And so Vance, my brain works very systematically and I'm very visual. So if you're listening and you're very visual, what I am hearing is kind of the groundwork that we need to lay, and the homework walking away from this episode is figure out why you're doing this. Figure out who you are. Figure out who you're for and who you're not for. Talk to your listeners offline and ask them, what do they feel when they listen to your show? Did I miss anything?
No, that's a pretty darn good summary. Good job.
Pretty good summary. Okay, great. Well, I'm really excited in the next episode to dive in and get tactical and get into the nitty gritty of, okay, once we have this groundwork and we're clear on these things, now how do we actually go about engineering a listening experience that drives our listeners to the action we want them to take? So Vance, thank you so much for all that you shared here today.
Love it. My pleasure.
So if you're well aware that people are listening to your podcast, but not clicking your links, they're not joining your list, and they're not buying your offers, then your listener journey is probably missing a few key steps. Luckily, it's all fixable, and Vance is back in the next episode to show you how to Disneyfy your own show by designing moments that lead people to take action, train your listeners to click, and feel good when they're doing it. So if you want to find out how to do it, head with me to the next episode and let's make your podcast binge-worthy.